Welcome, everybody. David, I want to start with you. We have seen lots of activity over the past 7 days with respect to Russia and Ukraine in the United States. A summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska on August 17th. A subsequent Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky and an impressive group of European leaders just a few days later. Lots of talk, lots of news coverage, lots of activity. What's really changed?
Huh. As near as I can tell, almost nothing. And at this point, we should count that as we should be grateful for that. If you go back and you look at day one, at the moment when Trump is sort of standing there clapping as Putin comes towards him on the red carpet, you really had no idea what was going to come next. And I had a sigh of relief when the press conference was announced and they came out and there was essentially no deal. And that might sound weird to say when you're talking about an incredibly destructive war, that there would be some sort of sigh of relief over no deal. That's only because it seemed like the only real deal on the table that was realistic to reach in that moment at that time was a deal that would eviscerate Ukraine, that would annihilate Ukraine's sovereignty, and wouldn't be a deal at all. And so that seemed to be the realistic fear in the moment. But as the hours and the days ticked by, there was just increased confusion. There were all these reports of ashen-faced Trump aides. Then there was some confusion around, okay, was there a migration away from the demand for a ceasefire and now to sort of a comprehensive peace arrangement in the Putin framework? Lots of confusion. So in comes Zelensky and in comes a bunch of European leaders. And I would kind of feel like it felt like an intervention, Steve. It felt like what we were watching was an intervention to try to see if they could collectively get Trump back in the right frame of mind. And that produced a bit of confusion as well, because there was even a tiny little news cycle about security guarantees for Ukraine that made it seem like Trump was willing to agree to Article 5-ish a kind of Article 5, we will defend you arrangement with Ukraine, which would be a massive, massive reversal from everything that he said before. Now,
and Article 5, David, just to clarify, Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which requires signatories to defend or participate in defending NATO countries.
Right, exactly. And so had Trump agreed to some sort of Article 5 type arrangement with Ukraine, that would have been just a massive shift, tremendous. And then that appears not to be the case. So where are we now? Latest news, at least, right before he did the podcast, was that now Putin seems to be not that eager to have a bilateral meeting with Zelensky. So it's very unclear as to where we are. One thing that we know for sure is the war continues unabated. There seems to be no sign of any meaningful concessions at all from Russia. I think Russia believes it is winning the war with some justification, but I mean, we can talk more about that. But as of right now, it's very hard for me to see what concretely has changed.
Yeah, Megan, last week we ended the podcast by talking about what a good outcome would be. And it's fair to say that the group collectively was not optimistic about a good outcome for Ukraine or for the United States. And David's right. In some senses, things aren't as bad as we suppose they might be. On the other hand, just days before this summit, Donald Trump threatened very severe consequences if Vladimir Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire. And Vladimir Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire. I don't see any consequences, severe or otherwise. And there's no sign that the United States is really serious about implementing those, about imposing sanctions, about new tariffs, the kinds of things that Trump threatened Putin with in the days leading up to their summit. So should we be heartened by the fact that things didn't go totally off the rails and the United States didn't abet Russia's claiming of additional Ukrainian territory, further selling out the Ukrainians? Or is this sort of status quo ante and the worst is yet to come?
Yeah, I mean, look, any silver lining I'll take, but it feels like shades of the Syria red line, where the Obama administration said, if you do this, we're gonna, come down on you like a ton of bricks. And then Syria did it. Bashar al-Assad did it. And then we didn't come down on them like a ton of bricks. And I actually, interestingly, I was in Europe at a conference, and I was actually surprised how mad Europe was. These European officials were saying, we were ready to go. We got all ready and you got us all head up, and then you did nothing. And it wasn't just that they were mad that like they didn't get the opportunity to embrickify, I guess. But also that they felt like Obama had, by making that threat and then not following through, had severely eroded their ability, the US's ability, but also Europe's ability to credibly negotiate this process. And I think that that's also going to be true here. That, look, it is in fairness, Russia's a nuclear armed power. It's really difficult. We don't have the kinds of options we have with a non-nuclear armed power. We have to be really careful about escalating. But I think that watching the Trump administration flail around is not giving me great hope for a good resolution to this.
Yeah, Jonah, do you see any signs that the Trump administration has a strategy at all? I mean, are they operating from some playbook? Do they know where they want this to end up? Or is this just all ad hoc diplomacy by Donald Trump when he's in the room at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think they have a strategy to get a headline that says Trump delivers peace, right? Not to get peace, not even to get the ceasefire, to say that Trump delivered it, right? And, you particularly with, I mean, this is true of all politicians. So you don't want to go too deep into Trump exceptionalism, but it's particularly hard with this administration to believe that there's stated reasons for anything. Pick a topic, National Guard troops in D.C. We can go down a long list. That their stated reasons are the actual reasons, and that their stated arguments are reflect their actual thinking. But J.D. Vance, as one does when one wants to lay out a serious foreign policy worldview, went on the Laura Ingraham show and said that, look, here's the problem. Ukraine wants security guarantees and Russia wants territory. And that's just not true. So if Vance believes it, they're working on a theory of the case that's wrong. And lots of bad things will flow from a wrong theory of the case. Sure, Russia wants territory in the sense that grabbing more territory is a means to one of their two strategic ends. The first strategic end is to basically make Ukraine like Belarus, right? A vassal state with a client leadership that is subordinate to Moscow, doesn't necessarily have to join some new Russian empire, but it has to be seen as part of Russia's sphere of influence and basically Putin's bitch. And that's the goal geostrategically vis-a-vis Ukraine. The other goal is to force a wedge between the United States and the NATO alliance. And this is the thing that bothers me a great deal about the talk about these security guarantees, is that the form and function of those things really, really matters. Because, and I'm not the first person to make this point. There are a lot of foreign policy graybeards who've been making this point. If it's just British and French and German troops on the ground without much American participation and in Ukraine with this vague talk of Article 5-ish stuff or Article 5-like stuff, and Russia does one of 10 time-honored Russian tactics, sending green men in, faking a terrorist attack, something where everybody, like all of the people who miraculously fall off roofs or fall out windows in Moscow, the reason they do those kinds of tactics is they want people to know that the state is complicit and did it, but have this sort of superficial thing that passive aggressively forces it on others to prove it. And so there are all sorts of ways that Russia could attack Western installation, Western troops, tease them, goad them, troll them, kill them, doesn't matter. And then the moment America doesn't get their back, well, then all of a sudden, Article 5-like means kind of nothing. The Western alliance is split. NATO is thrown into even more doubt. And the nations that are in Russia's near abroad are like, crap, security assurances from the West don't actually matter that much. So therefore, we probably should cut a deal with Putin, right? So like everyone's talking about what a huge victory it would be to have a security guarantee. To have a real security guarantee, it might really be one, right? I don't know what it would look like. It really matters in the details. But simply having one that gives Russia the benefits of a timeout for them to retool, rearm, recalibrate their craptacular economy, which people aren't paying enough attention to. You know, Kazakhstan, according to the IMF, just passed Russia in per capita GDP, which has got to be really embarrassing for the Russians. So anyway, my only point is like, I don't think Steve Witkoff, who talks about this stuff the way I talk about the NFL draft, like, I kind of know some of the terms, but I couldn't really defend any of my claims. I don't trust him. And I think Trump, to the extent he understands any of this stuff and listens to any of this stuff, his quote unquote strategic objective is to add this war to the 6 bogus wars he claims to have solved in pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize. And so if that's the PR objective, if the strategic objective is a PR objective, I don't think you're going to get the strategy right.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the rhetoric coming. I would point to, in particular, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio over the last week. They keep talking about the U.S. strategic objective, or at least main objective, being the end of the war and the United States stopping supporting Ukraine. If we keep announcing that our goal is to stop supporting Ukraine, isn't Vladimir Putin's best move to just say, okay, we'll wait?
Yeah.
And doesn't that, I mean, my sense is, you know, there's been this back and forth about the ceasefire leading to a longer term peace deal or just moving directly to a peace deal. And Putin would rather not agree to a ceasefire. The Europeans have been pushing in the Oval Office and elsewhere for a ceasefire as a prelude to sort of a broader deal. I guess my interpretation of what Putin is trying to do is just delay, because the United States has signaled again and again and again during the campaign, in the first 8 months of the Trump administration, and now repeatedly over the past several days as these negotiations are unfolding, that we don't want anything to do with this anymore. Am I misreading this, Megan?
No, and I think even beyond what the administration is signaling, I think you can look at Donald Trump and say this man has the attention span of a meth-addled gnat. And so all you have to do is, it's sort of like the weather in San Francisco. If you don't like it, wait 5 minutes. And I think that that's also been true historically with Trump's policy in general. With sadly the lone exception of tariffs and immigration crackdowns. Otherwise, right, he will get bored. He will move on to something else. And Russia just wants to wait for that, which if I were Russia, I would probably feel the same way, since I do not support their invasion of Ukraine or indeed their defenestration of random dissidents. Although, I don't know, perhaps that just signals that Russia really needs to revisit its building codes. Then I think, you know, it's not a great look for the United States, let us say.
So what you're saying is Moscow needs more abundance Dems.
Yes.
To clear away their red tape so they can get better building codes.
Parachute in Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, and Matt Iglesias.
We're going to get to the abundance Dems here shortly and other Democrats. But David, before we do, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there were some really prescient words I heard right before Trump took office this term. And I was talking to some people who had been following the war just, you know, moment by moment since it unfolded, since the invasion was launched. And they said that Donald Trump has not dealt with post-war Putin. That the Putin that he dealt with before was a Putin who was used to getting what he wanted without so blunt an instrument, without the sledgehammer, more with a chisel and less with the sledgehammer, and that he had success with little green men. He kind of viewed himself as deft in diplomacy. He could maneuver and get what he wanted. He said, no, this is not the Putin you make a deal with. This is the Putin who, at this point, had almost 1 million casualties, hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed, fully invested in the war, total war economy, not total mobilization of manpower, but mobilizing by some estimates, 30,000 new soldiers a month, that he's all in. He's absolutely all in on this, and that Trump has not dealt with that. And you can see that, how that's unfolded, that this whole time, Putin has just been in the same position. We keep what we took, we'll take a little bit more, and oh, by the way, Ukraine isn't functionally independent anymore. That's how you end the war. And he hasn't budged 1 millimeter, not one millionth of a millimeter from that position. And I've just thought of those words, that this is not the Putin that Trump expected to be dealing with. This is a Putin who sees himself now in that almost czarist war leader mode, and he's not backing down an inch until he's made to back down, until it becomes in his immediate interest to have a ceasefire. And so that's, to me, the number one critique of the Biden administration was this slow rollout of aid, this excessive caution, because the only thing that was going to stop Putin was that if it just got too costly for him. And then here we have the on again, off again aid, sometimes being turned off with Trump reportedly not even knowing about it. The on again, off again focus on a peace deal. Meantime, Putin just keeps grinding it out. And that's what everybody needs to wake up and realize, is he is absolutely dedicated to grinding this thing out.
Yeah, so one quick point on that, just because I think it's really useful for people who don't pay granular attention to this stuff. And this is one of the very few issues that I actually still paying very close attention to. When the Russians said in Anchorage on Friday, we can get to all of these questions about security this and blah, 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 that, once we've dealt with the underlying or root causes of this conflict. What the Russians mean by that explicit, it's a euphemism, but they've footnoted it a zillion times, what they mean by that. And what they mean by that is a legitimate democratic Western-facing government in Ukraine. They mean the Zelensky government is the root cause. They mean an independent. So, basically, the way to hear it, whenever you hear Lavrov or any of those other guys talking about the underlying causes of this conflict, what you should hear is the continued existence of Ukraine as an independent state is the underlying cause of this conflict. Yeah. Everything else flows from that in terms of the Russian position. Putin reiterated this last June at a big conference where he said, look, first of all, we have a saying in Russian, wherever Russian troops set foot, that land becomes ours. And it's on video. I linked to it in my latest column. And he said, look, at the end of the day, there really is no Ukraine because they're our brothers, and that the country belongs to us. It's part of Russia. That is their position. They've said nothing fundamental to contradict that. Any ceasefire or pause, and they've broken. I tried to do a list once, and it just got endless of the number of times they've broken ceasefires, humanitarian corridors, all these kinds of things. You can
things
literally
that they have agreed to. Yeah,
they've agreed to that they touted about their love of peace, and then they wait.
Right.
In 2014, they agreed to a humanitarian corridor to get in the Donbass to get civilians out of the city. Waited for them to be on the road as they were leaving town in compliance with the agreement, and then started shelling it. They're bad actors. They lie. Marco Rubio in 2022, there's a great clip of him going on and on about how all these people think you can do a deal with Putin, but you can't because he's just such a liar. But anyway, the point is the strategic objective, there are only two, is one, screw with NATO and the Western Alliance, and two, make Ukraine a vassal state at best, a territory of Russia. And when you hear them say the underlying causes, that's what they mean.
I think that's one of the things that struck me as I watched the Oval Office meeting and I watched what transpired in Alaska. We seem to be having this kind of global conversation on two totally different levels. You hear Donald Trump saying, for instance, that Vladimir Putin wants peace. And you remember all of the things that you just spoke about, Jonah. It's clear that that Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace, or if he wants peace, he only wants peace on those sort of absurd terms. But you watch the European leaders in the Oval Office sort of buttering up Donald Trump. I mean, using his language, we need to stop the killing, they say. It's this play acting, sort of global diplomacy as play acting, that seems to me to obscure the real issues at stake. I mean, the way that you just laid it out, Jonah, this is what Vladimir Putin wants. Everybody knows this is what he wants. He keeps saying it. It's not really a question. And yet we're having these conversations, I think, driven by the Trump administration that pretend Putin is somebody he's not and pretend he wants something he doesn't. And it's just this bizarre sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's this bizarre thing to watch because you see, reporters are asking questions based on, I think, a series of flawed assumptions, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening. The big players are pretending things can happen or will happen that are never, ever going to happen. And it leaves us in this weird place where we could be making progress. I would say the tone of the reporting coming out of Alaska and then coming out of the European meeting is more optimistic than most people would have thought. But as David points out, without real progress, how as if you were there covering this thing, how do you cover it in that way? Make that part clear, so that people understand this is all of this conversation is just sort of part of a play. It's not real. David, any thoughts?
And also, I think when you're looking at the way people are treating Trump, I think MAGA views it one way, but there's a different way to view it that is much closer to the truth. And I think one of the ways that MAGA views it is look at the way in which people have to come and pay tribute to him. We have the whip hand. We are in charge here. And I've seen some things online of contrasting when he's sitting sort of at a table and all of the European leaders are hovering over him from his first term. And then this next one, he's sitting at the table and they're kind of all around him in chairs like he's lecturing them this time and how things have changed. I don't think this is what's happening at all. I think what's happening is a lot of people have realized that he can be really easily manipulated in the moment. And Putin realizes that, they realize that. So Putin comes in, and what does Putin say to him? You won the election in 2020, right? You can't have fair elections with mail-in ballots. I never would have invaded if you were president, right? All of these things. And so that's pumping up Trump. And Trump goes on national television afterwards and makes these points like Putin's handed him a big win. So what do all of the other people do? And they adopt a similar approach. And if you can look 1 inch below it, it's not flattery. They're actually seething with contempt. They have contempt. And it is too easy. It is so easy to walk into the room and to say the things that at least can pull him on side in that moment. Now, the sad thing is, let's suppose the 7 Europeans actually in that moment got him to sort of rethink and reset for a bit. Well, he'll be in a different room at a different time with different people who flatter him, and they'll reset him in another way. And this pattern is becoming completely and obviously apparent to everyone at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you said it much better than I did. I mean, and all the while, the fundamentals don't change. And Putin still wants what he wants. The quote unquote root causes are still the root causes, and we've made no more progress toward peace. Let's move from war and peace and a rather depressing discussion about that to the coming debt crisis, just as sort of a pick-me-up. I was reading this past week an article in Foreign Affairs by Kenneth Rogoff, a Harvard professor and the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, who basically took a big, long look at the United States and our penchant for accumulating debt and came to this conclusion. With long-term interest rates up sharply, public debt is nearing post-World War II peak, foreign investors becoming more skittish, and politicians showing little appetite for reining in fresh borrowing, the possibility of a once-in-a-century U.S. debt crisis no longer seems far-fetched. Debt and financial crisis tend to occur precisely when a country's fiscal situation is already precarious, its interest rates are high, its political situation is paralyzed, and a shock catches policymakers on the back foot. The United States already checks the first 3 boxes. All that is missing is the shock. Megan, you have long covered the economy and economics and long been sounding the alarm on debt and the accumulation of public debt in the United States.
You can see how well that worked too. So
no, I know. Believe me, I feel as useless as you do sometimes. Has been an obsession of mine.
Feeling as useless as me, Steve, is a really low point. I'm sorry.
Pretty low, pretty bad. When the Dispatch launched in October of 2019, the U.S. debt was $22.7 trillion. It is today $37 trillion and climbing. I guess first question is, what do you make of Rogoff's
Just to be clear,
analysis?
Causation does not equal correlation.
Thank you for pointing that out.
We'd be living a lot better if we got 1% of that. You know?
We have been futilely sounding the alarm in the 6 years we've been in existence. Megan, what do you think of Rogoff's framing of sort of this moment? And he talks of a shock, and the I guess by definition, a shock is something you don't see coming necessarily. Yeah. But if we were to worry about proverbial shocks, that could be the fourth of the four boxes that he would check. What should we be looking for?
And it could be anything. The pandemic was such a shock, right? Where we had to go out and borrow an enormous amount of money to finesse what was happening to the economy. You could have another financial crisis. I don't think that's likely. But there are some areas of the economy where leverage is popping up again, private credit, the AI build out. There's some question about how well those investments are going to pay out. Although, to be clear, I'm an AI boomer long term, but often when you have emergent technologies, things get a little bubbly, and to the extent that this is being financed with private credit rather than traditional bank loans or by retained earnings, then there's some question about, is that leverage maybe going to percolate through the economy if they can't pay back their loans? But we don't know what it is. It could be a war, right? I mean, this is something I am hearing more and more from fiscal experts. I was at a fiscal conference at Hoover last year, incredibly depressing. And, people just looked at these levels of debt, as I had been doing, and said, this is unsustainable. And I said, well, how does this go wrong? And one expert just said, look, something happens. China invades Taiwan. We need money to finance a defense buildup. We go out to the debt market and say, I need $10 billion. And the debt market's just like, no, I don't think so. But there's also a kind of slow-moving crisis where rates just stay high, where people look at our debt levels and say, something's going to happen. You guys are not going to pay this back in real terms, right? You are going to inflate away the value of the debt. You are going to cram it down on your financial institutions, very popular option. But one way or another, you are not going to be able to pay this back because you just don't have the economic growth capacity to meet both politically very important entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, and to meet your obligations to bondholders. And that's a really real scenario now. I think you are already seeing, there's some argument about this, but you're already seeing that the government has been borrowing shorter. So there was a movement at the beginning of the financial crisis where people looked at, or the beginning of the aftermath of the financial crisis, I should say, the kind of early to mid-teens, where people looked at these incredibly low interest rates and said, you know what we should do? We should borrow longer term. We should convert our debt. And little primer for those following along at home is that government debt is not like your mortgage. It's not what's known as self-amortizing. Basically, we just pay interest to the bondholders, and then when that bond comes due, we have to pay them back the full face value of the bond. And so what we do is, instead of just slowly, gradually paying down our debt, we then usually go back into the debt, unless we're running a surplus, we go back into the debt market and we borrow more money under roughly the same terms. And the issue with that is that if interest rates have gone up, you can have a situation where your old debt paid 2%, your new debt pays 6%. These are, by the way, numbers, for example, not real numbers about U.S. debt right now. And suddenly you've now your payment's going up. That puts a further pinch on you. Now you want to borrow more money to finesse that. And so that can happen. that problem can emerge very quickly. So what they did was they started making this debt longer term. Well, that's kind of reversed, and now they're borrowing a lot more short. And I was talking to someone who said, I would talk to officials and say, interest rates are at rock bottom, in 2019, 2022. You should be further lengthening the maturity of the U.S. debt structure in order to take this. And they would say, but I would have to pay a higher premium now to get a longer term loan. Why would I do that? That's costing the taxpayers money. Like, it was just not possible that interest rates would go up. And so we're now in a situation where our debt service costs are climbing extremely rapidly, and where we are extremely vulnerable. Look, I mean, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget just put out a paper saying that, debt's going to go to 120% of GDP. It's almost 100% now. And then, at these interest rates, the deficits can go to 2.6 trillion. These are not sustainable numbers, even for an economy as big and powerful as the U.S. And I would add that a lot of the things that the Trump administration is doing with tariffs, with kind of uncertain regulatory policy where everything's changing all the time, that's making us a less attractive destination for foreign money already. So you've got all of these confluences of factors that I think do make it a real risk. We won't know what the crisis is until it hits. But we should be assuming that crisis is very possible and treating that like an emergency. We need to get back to a spot where we're not going to have a crisis. And the problem is that no one on Capitol Hill or in the White House is interested in doing that, because that would mean fiscal pain now. It would mean raising taxes and cutting spending. And why would you do that? Voters hate that. So, they're going to hate the financial crisis more, to be very clear. But the thing is, maybe the guy who voted for it won't be in office when that happens. So, make hay while the sun shines.
So, David, I mean, there's been a case, and Meghan's been making it, for treating this like an emergency for decades, really. But we are at this point. I mean, I remember having these conversations about, what was going to be an unacceptable debt to GDP ratio 10, 15 years ago. And we're there. I mean, this is now the moment. And we don't have anybody who's taking this seriously, who's even talking about it. For a while, Republicans, during this sort of Paul Ryan era, could claim, I think with some credibility, that they were the party who was at least offering to reform the programs that were driving the debt more than anything else. But here we are, to Meghan's point, in fiscal year 2024, the United States spent $850 billion on defense, but $880 billion simply on interest payments.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who's going to make this case other than, a few of us in the wind over here on a podcast?
Well, I feel, a couple of things. Let me just say, it is a joy to listen to Meghan in her absolute wheelhouse talking about these issues. Just the granular detail, fantastic. Second, I feel like, you remember the movie The Big Short, just this really fun movie about the build up to the financial crisis and how, the way the movie depicts it, not exactly completely realistic, but quasi-realistic, which is the people who saw this were sort of saw this coming, and at least coming in all of its awfulness. We're kind of a minority, a small band of quirky people. I don't feel like this we have been talking about the debt and deficit in the United States for so long. I'm old enough to remember, and I don't know if you guys remember this. Do you remember when the Democrats would run deficit trial commercials against Reagan? That in the future, the kids were going to be prosecuting the adults for the way that they had allowed deficits to just to bloom out of control. So I feel like what we have instead is sort of almost like what you might call a climate change type problem. And that is, for a very long time, the people who've been saying climate change is an urgent thing that we really need to get our hands around have been making doomerist predictions about what will happen in the environment that don't happen. And so you can go back and you can look at like a news broadcast from 1998 and it'll say something by 2010, it could be this. Well, 2010 comes around and it doesn't happen. And I think that part of that, we kind of have a bit of that problem in talking about debt and deficits, that there's been a cohort of people talking about the danger of debt and deficits for so long that a lot of people, it's kind of buzzing in their ears. And I remember reading a really interesting Noah Smith column years and years ago, where he said, think of the debt, and I've used this analogy on the Dispatch podcast before. He said, think of this enormous amount of debt as you're walking down an infinite corridor with an invisible pit, that there is a point at which there is too much. Where people have been getting it wrong is they've maybe put that point a little too low, that our economies actually could kind of muscle through all of this in a way that we didn't quite anticipate. But the fact that we have not had the kind of crisis that a lot of people predicted doesn't mean that you can just keep accumulating. And I think we saw a bit of a preview of that in the inflation during the Biden era, which was, and Megan, I don't want to intrude too much into her absolute wheelhouse here, but this sort of idea that we can just spend.
The water's fine.
Yeah, that we can just spend and spend and spend and not have an inflationary effect. Well, that concept is done now. So I think more people are waking up, but at the same time, they're waking up to this reality and turning to one of the worst political classes we've had in the modern history of the United States and say, do something about this. And of course, they're not, at least not right now.
Yeah, and something we should be clear about is that almost all of the debt, the really problematic debt, was accumulated in two bursts following the financial crisis and during the pandemic. That people like to yell at Reagan, they like to yell at Bush, but honestly, they were running deficits that were not ideal. I don't love a 3% budget deficit, but they were functionally sustainable. The Reagan deficits were not sustainable, but then they did a tax reform that basically raised enough revenue to lower it to a level where, between inflation and economic growth, you can pretty much run that level of deficit forever because you're not the overall debt to GDP ratio doesn't rise that much. So by the end of Bush's term, for all the yelling about deficits, before the financial crisis hits, right, in 2007, our national debt's like a third of GDP. That is a sustainable level. Under Obama, it rockets up to about 3/4 of GDP. And then during the pandemic, it goes up to actually over 100% of GDP, but partly that was an artifact of GDP collapsing in 2020. And then the problem is that a couple things. First of all, I would argue that both after the financial crisis and after the pandemic, we overspent. We did more than we needed to because it was politically popular. Like, we didn't really need to bail out GM. We did not need to spend $10 billion doing that. 10 billion net, 50 total. Because this was not something that probably meaningfully improved the performance of the economy at large. It meaningfully improved the fortunes of an important Democratic constituency. But by the late 2019s, you have Trump, who's totally irresponsible, does this deficit finance tax cut, makes no effort to pay for it. But then you get on the left this ideology called modern monetary theory, which it's really less of an economic theory than like a Gnostic religious experience that I am unable to access. I kept trying to get people to explain to me how this would work, and there would just be a point where they were like, and then the magic happens, and I would get lost. But the problem was that Democrats wanted an ideology that told them that they did not have to control their spending at all. And, there were also sensible people like Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who, by the way, I respect deeply, but would say, well, interest rates are really low. We should be borrowing to fund investment. And I would say, but interest rates might not always be low. And the political economy of our country is such that we're not just going to borrow to fund investment. We're going to borrow it to fund garbage. And then if interest rates, we're not going to pay it back. And then if interest rates go up, we're screwed, which is, in fact, exactly what happened. So, congratulations, Megan, I guess. The prize is that everything's miserable. And that phenomenon, by the time you get to Biden, people are just like, well, we can spend any amount of money and we don't have to pay for any of it, which is exactly what they did. They're sending out checks after vaccinations have started, which is not necessary. The economy is already primed to recover. And they get a huge burst of inflation, some of which was driven by supply shocks, but some of which was driven by the sheer amount of money that we pumped into the economy. The Trump administration also sent out unnecessary checks after we'd started vaccinating because he wanted to look like a good guy. And all of those factors have driven our debt to an unsustainable level. And then the Biden administration made no effort. There is an argument for spending during emergencies, for borrowing and spending when you are having a once-in-a-century pandemic. But the Biden administration, the deficits didn't really go down much after the pandemic because they wanted to give out goodies to the voters. And now the Trump administration also wants to give out goodies to the voters. And no one is thinking about, okay, guys, you are creating this enormous risk for the American economy. And it's so enormous that unlike 10 or 15 years ago, this could happen on your watch. And then you can have to do the non-fun part.
So, Jonah, I mean, there's a long and bitter indictment to be made of sort of cowardly elected officials who are responsible for this. Both parties, neither party is wearing the white hats in this. But to Megan's last point, isn't this fundamentally a voter problem? Voters want stuff. They want goodies. The case that Paul Ryan made, he was able to win over a majority of the Republicans in the House on entitlement reform. He got them to put it in their annual budgets, which was, I think, quite an accomplishment. But fundamentally, voters aren't clamoring for this. They're happy to have this. The programs that we're talking about reforming are popular with voters, and it works when elected officials give out goodies to voters to win votes. It didn't work for Joe Biden, but in general, it works. Isn't this a voter problem as much or more than it is an elected official problem?
Yeah, you guys know one of my favorite lines from Orwell is about how a man can feel himself to be a failure and therefore take to drink, and then by taking to drink become even more of a failure. It's a catalytic thing here where you've had politicians cry wolf, say everything is going to go to hell if we borrow $5 more, and then it didn't happen. You have the rotating hypocrisy, right? Sort of like, like just as an example, filibusters, right? On a filibuster, when the filibuster is inconvenient for you, you start screaming about how it's a impediment to democracy. It's this antiquated relic from a bygone time. And then when your side, when everybody switches teams in and out of power, all of a sudden the other side picks up the rhetoric that the other team left behind. We've done the same thing on debt for 30 years, 40 years. And particularly in a populist moment, that's a populist moment in part because of the screw ups about how we've handled the financial stuff. We have this deep seated distrust of experts, and when you have this age of cynicism, which assumes that everybody is arguing out of self interest, and therefore someone else is going to get rewarded. It should be me. There's just little appetite to take anybody seriously about these problems. And I was waiting for someone here to bring it up because it seems to me what brings all of this together. If you're talking about the craven, gobsmacking, almost evil. I try to keep the word evil out of most budgetary debates, but failures of their political class. The idea that will symbolize it the most is if Josh Hawley succeeds in winning this argument that many in the Trump administration favor of giving out bread and circuses checks, right? Just giving cash payments as a refund on the tariffs, right? It's a tariff rebate, which, I don't want to trigger Megan or anybody, but like the whole idea that they're being rebated on tariffs that the Trump administration claims other countries are paying in the first place, just logically, you can't connect the dots. But regardless, if they take the money that they're raising in an inefficient, growth dampening way, with this new tax that they're bragging about, first Republican administration in our lifetimes to brag about just massive revenues from a tax that they levied, unconstitutionally in many respects, so put that aside. And then they are just going to cut checks to people in a Huey Long style, chicken in every pot, fiscal act of vandalism. That is a sign that they don't mean anything at all about the debt, And I think that could be one of those triggering things that just everyone watching from outside the fishbowl are like, holy crap, they're really not serious about this. The other one, which I think could trigger this, and that, I know they talked about it recently on AO, is the Scott Bessent argument now, which says the Supreme Court has to agree to the constitutionality of all of these tariffs, because if they don't, it will trigger a 1929 style financial collapse, which that sort of rhetoric, which I think is really stupid on the merits for so many reasons I cannot get into here. But there's a real danger of that kind of rhetoric becoming self-fulfilling. Like, if you tell the MAGA base, if the Supreme Court does this, the country is going to go into a financial crisis, and then the Supreme Court does it, which I think they should, that's how you get runs on banks and stuff, right? I mean, like the psychology of that is really, really, really bad.
And he's the responsible one in the cabinet, right? I mean, everybody points to Scott Bessent as the responsible one in the cabinet.
So, like, I completely agree. Like so many things that's launched really bad events and cascade events, the reason for it doesn't need to be rational, right? I mean, like, it wasn't really rational for Gavrilo Princip to kill Archduke Ferdinand, but a lot of things happened after that. The precipitating causes of the 1929, stock market crash, we could have an argument about what they were, but like, it didn't have to be any one of those straws that broke those camel back. The reaction to this stuff could be really, really bad, and we could see a bond market crisis or something like that happen for really dumb reasons. And saying, oh, well, they shouldn't have done that, doesn't matter at that.
So can I ask a question to the group here? It appears to me that there's a lot of value in our economy that is fundamentally notional. So we have large amounts of money invested in Bitcoin, for example. And Bitcoin, although certainly the use cases for cryptocurrency are growing or expanding, they strike me that Bitcoin is valued way beyond its actual economic sort of worth to economic worth within a market economy. Similarly, we have huge investment in AI, just giant investment in AI. By some accounts, accounting for more of our economic growth than consumer spending in the moment. And a lot of that is speculative investment. It is not based on the money that the AI is actually producing, but the thought of what it will do. How vulnerable are sort of these notional elements of our economy? How vulnerable are we with that many assets tied into vaporware? I don't know.
Bitcoin is actually a really small share of the economy. It's a large share of the mind space of people like us. But I don't foresee a problem in crypto specifically right now. Now, that's not to say it couldn't happen, but look, the way could we have
data point on that really quick? Like, the Sam Bankman-Fried collapse was huge. And it was barely a ripple in the broader economy.
It just didn't matter. There's a very excellent column on this in the Washington Post, by the way. Can't remember who wrote it. So there's two kinds of recessions we could have out of that notional value. And one is like the recession of 2001. There's a big run up in the stock market. Everyone's betting big on, pets.com and that service that would take bike messengers to like deliver you a soda. And when that collapses, when people realize that no, PE ratios of 500 are probably not sustainable, we have a recession, right? Because people feel poorer, they cut back on their spending. Governments, especially in California, are getting fewer capital gains taxes. But it's a pretty mild recession. It did not feel mild to me, to be clear. I spent 2 years looking for a job. However, because I just graduated from business school right into the recession. But it wasn't a big economic event like 2008. What happened in 2008 is that you've got what economists call leverage and what the rest of us call borrowing. And debt crises are different. Debt crises ripple through the economy. They multiply, they amplify, they take down everything. It's like a snowballing avalanche that just gets bigger and bigger, gathering more, and then it just wipes everything out. And that's a different question. So the way that Bitcoin or AI could trigger that kind of really bad, deep recession is if people are levered within other markets. Now, after the financial crisis, we did actually do a fair amount of work to keep big financial institutions from acquiring that kind of leverage, from having too little equity, having too little of like the core savings of the business in the business, and to require people to have more assets for their liabilities and so forth. But every time you do this, there is demand to create products that allow people to take on more risk. And so, for example, in 2008, what actually triggered the run was not the collapse of Lehman so much as the collapse of this money market mutual fund you've never heard of. Now, money market mutual funds emerged in the 1970s to get around interest rate restrictions that had been imposed during the Great Depression, because once inflation started ticking up, that became a real problem for savers. And so there's always that activity in the market of like, wow, there's all these regulations keeping me from taking too much risk. How can I fix that? And so the question is, how much leverage is there in the system? There's more than there was 5-10 years ago because private credit is growing. I don't think there's as much as there was in 2007. And so I'm not super worried about a pandemic or level event, a financial crisis level event, but I am worried that I wasn't worried about that in 2007 either. I had no idea. I knew there was a housing bubble. I called the housing bubble in like 2003. The Economist was calling it in 1999. What I didn't see was how that was going to ripple through these parts of the financial system that were pretty opaque, and that I didn't have a lot of visibility into like what the knock-on effects of the collapse would be.
Isn't part of the problem that when people look at things like the stock market or their own 529s or 401ks or what have you, everything seems great. Like, hey, this is a pretty good time. It's hard for me to imagine that these long-term theoretical problems that people have been talking about, as David points out, for years, are actually going to threaten that, would cause me those kinds of problems. But it seems to me false confidence. I mean, at some point, that stuff is going to matter, right?
Yeah, and it's sort of mysterious to me why markets have been so kind to all of this, except that as the argument that, well, the United States has a lot of problems. We're kind of the prettiest ugly girl on the block. And, where else are you going to put your money?
So I've actually heard that. I mean,
Europe?
what's interesting is I had a conversation with somebody who's involved in running a big sovereign wealth fund from overseas. And we were talking about this very thing. And he said, what am I going to do? What are we going to do? Are we going to redirect our investments to China right now? Nope, we're not. Where are we looking? Europe? Nope. The United States is still the best. And we're the best until such time as we're not the best. I just fear that time is gradually creeping up on us for all the reasons that you've laid out. I'm going to call an audible, and we are going to table our discussion of Democrats actually in disarray.
But what if they're not in disarray by next week?
That's a good point. Jonah, you read my mind. I was going to say we will revisit this next week because probably we'll just have more evidence that Democrats are in disarray.
Jonah, have you met any Democrats? This does not seem particularly likely.
Look, Gavin Newsom's Twitter feed, it's fixing it all.
It really is.
Yeah.
Oh.
This is what's called in the business a tease. This is a good tease for our discussion next week. There'll be plenty to discuss, and I don't want to do it. Try to do it in just a couple minutes. I have a correction before we get to not worth your time. Last week, in our very edifying discussion of crime in Washington, D.C., I mentioned the fact that my daughter had witnessed a homeless man defecating in front of 400 North Capitol, a building that's right near the U.S. Capitol. And
it turns out that Jesse Waters has a home?
No comment. My daughter heard the podcast, probably because she listens to every Dispatch podcast, or maybe because she saw a clip on social media. But either way, she heard this clip and she came to me and accused me of peddling fake news and said that she did not, in fact, witness this man defecating, but she saw the man and she saw the product and put those things together, understood that that's what happened. So just to be clear, abundantly clear, she did not witness this. But I think the broader point holds. That's my correction. We will be sure to put that in the dispatch. We now have a policy that Declan
Megan, would that
Garvey.
be called Bayesian reasoning, that she figured out what had happened? Is that how Bayesian works?
I think it would be like inductive logic, maybe.
Okay, all right.
Inference. I don't know. You went to law school, David. Don't they do all those logic questions on the LSAT?
Yeah, but they got rid of the logic games from the LSAT. Yeah. So
strong circumstantial evidence, right, David?
Yes.
It's not
kids these days. They have the easy LSAT. Come on.
Yeah.
Well,
whatever it is,
that would be circumstantial evidence, not dispositive evidence, right?
Circumstantial evidence, yes.
Yeah. However we categorize it, it was clear that it needed to be corrected. Declan Garvey, our executive editor, has started a program a few months ago, and I love it, where the Dispatch publishes a piece, an article, a collective piece of all of our corrections in any given month. We do it at the first of every month. And thankfully, thus far, those lists have been pretty small. But I like it as a way to further accountability journalism and to call ourselves out. So I will make sure that I share this with Declan, and we will have a formal correction about this in the next article on our corrections. Finally, I want to end with a not worth your time that I would say is of almost the same magnitude of the big things that we discussed this week: war and peace, the future of a peaceful world, the possibility of a debt crisis here in the United States. This one I want to talk about a problem that we've all, I think, faced. You're running late to the grocery store and you're trying just to zip in real quickly, get in a missing ingredient for your recipe, Megan, maybe for one of your pies, or you're dropping a kid at school and you are trying to pull into the parking lot and get out real quickly. And you encounter someone who I call a backer-inner, who pulls forward, and then rather than just pulling into the spot with the front of his car, instead pulls beyond the spot, backs in, screws it up, takes a lot of time, might even require you to pull in reverse. I encountered a backer-inner. I'm here in Northwest Ohio. I ran to the Kroger this morning to get a coffee, and I encountered a backer-inner, and I almost hit him because he pulled forward and then pulled backward. My question to you, and I'll start with you, Jonah, are you a backer-inner? And assuming you're not, assuming that none of us are backer-inners, but if we have a backer-inner among us, I'd love to hear a defense. Are you a backer-inner? And if you're not a backer-inner, is the proper punishment for backer-inners the death penalty?
So I am not a backer-inner, but I've done it more than my wife thinks should be permissible by law. She is where you are about death penalty being too good for you. She has some very convoluted theories about, like, I don't want to say toxic masculinity because that's not a term she would use, but like sort of backer-inner bros with really large trucks that take way too much time doing it. So
my guy today, just to point of clarification, my guy today was definitely a backer-inner bro with a large truck and might have had the truck testicles hanging off the bottom as he did
truck
it.
Nuts. It's
truck
nuts.
Truck nuts.
Yeah. Come on. Get it right.
So I will say, I like when I pull out, I like being able to go first and not like fear backing into a shopping cart or a small child or anything like that. So one of the things I will often do is I will forego a closer spot to the front of the supermarket in favor of a spot where I can pull into it and then go to the other side. So I'm in effect looks like I've backed in, but I've just gone forward. And so like I don't get there's some specific circumstances where I get wanting to back out because of like the kind of groceries you got to load, and you got a lot of stuff in your trunk and blah 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 blah. I don't get the people who are passionate about it. That's the thing that I think is really weird. I think when the stakes are really, really low and it's really easy to do it. But otherwise, if it's a crowded parking lot, don't mess with people. Don't screw up don't take time out of people's days, and don't increase likelihood of you like scratching somebody else's car or whatever. So I am not as passionate as you or my wife are about this issue, but I'm basically where you are.
Megan, are you a backer inner?
No, because I learned to drive in New York City, and I find front parking or back parking extremely difficult. Parallel parking, the natural God's way of parking, extremely easy. But so I will be at the very back of the parking lot finding a spot that I can pull through, because the problem of pulling a car into a parking garage, or a parking spot by forward, which I basically didn't do until I was in my 30s. I find it terrifying. I'm too old to learn. I just go out. I will say, look, I am against the death penalty in all cases. The state should not murder other human beings. But have we thought about bringing back the stocks, right? I think that there are a lot of historical punishments that we need to explore in greater depth to handle this antisocial behavior.
Also, certainty of punishment is more important than severity of punishment. So,
David, you, as I recall, have a truck. You've got a beard. You fit. If we're working from stereotypes that Jonah offered, you fit a couple of the characteristics.
You have the truck nuts, though.
No truck nuts, but soy boys and cuck-servatives. This guy's a backer inner.
Oh no! Are you really?
Absolutely.
Oh,
why?
Absolutely.
Why?
Unbelievable.
When you purchase a four-wheel drive pickup truck in the South, it's a contractual obligation. You sign it, you agree. And if you don't back in, you have to seek a waiver, an individual waiver of your contractual obligation. No, it's first, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. You either do the forward back thing on the front end or the back end. So if you pull in, you're still pulling out and correcting and moving. So it's just, where do you put it, on the front end or the back end? And I like to back in, because it's much easier to get out. Yeah, absolutely. And so when
you could park far away from the door, pull through, and it would be equally easy to get out, and you wouldn't be blocking other people.
Now, I am what you might call, some of my peers in four-wheel drive pickup truckdom would say I'm a squish backer inner, because if there is a big train of cars behind me, I'm going to pull in. I'm not going to make everybody wait. So I do request individualized waivers for my contractual obligations in that circumstance.
Okay, suspended sentence, David. I've
Yes, but as a general matter, 100%. My truck right now is backed in. Like right now, where it is sitting, it is backed in.
Oh man.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I'll give you, David. I'll give you some backup here. Gary Bubar, a traffic safety specialist with AAA, told the Arizona Republic, "It is actually better to back in if you can." And I will quote Gary Bubar. "What the research suggests is that any time that you can minimize your blind spots when you exit the parking spot, you're less likely to have any kind of a fender bender or other mishap. When you're backing out of a spot, there are multiple blind spots that can limit your vision and make it more difficult to see any drivers that might be waiting for you or for your spot or coming past you." So you have some expert backing for your antisocial, totally indefensible behavior. But I do think that we're going to have to consider some kind of a punishment.
It is a funny thing that you say about four-wheel drives and backing in, because a few months ago, I was speaking at a men's Bible study, a prayer breakfast, and I wasn't quite finding, it was sort of an out-of-the-way building, and I wasn't quite finding where I needed to be. And then I looked up and I saw a parking lot full of Ford F-150s backed in. And I was like, that's it. That is the men's prayer breakfast right there. And I was absolutely correct. So
it's almost too perfect.
I backed in, enjoyed them.
So can I ask, it's sort of not worth your time adjacent, can I make a good parenting tip that's related to this? And this is from hard-earned experience. When your kid, as a teenager, starts driving for the first time, it also means they start parking for the first time. And they're bad at it. your kid out there in listener land might be marginally better than the median kid or the mean kid, but they're all bad at it. We established a policy of, after so many scratches on the paint on the car, if in any parking garage, like when you go to the movies, the mall, anything like that, don't even attempt to park next to any other cars. Go to the first spot, no matter how far away, that does not have a car on either side of the spot, and that's where you park until you get better at this. And you'll be glad.
I'm still
you followed
waiting,
my
by
advice.
the way. That is still where I park. My husband finds this very funny, and I found it very funny. He's from Florida, that he couldn't parallel park when we first met, and I had to teach him. He's now a very good parallel parker because we street park our car. I have never become a good garage parker. It's terrifying. Can't you make those spaces bigger?
But Megan, as a fellow New Yorker, when you see someone parallel park front end first, does it trigger you?
Oh gosh,
Oh my gosh,
that's almost as bad as backer inners.
Well,
Yeah,
look,
I mean,
I look, if there's enough space, I will parallel park front
Sure,
in.
but it's not really parallel parking. It's just taking like
Yeah,
the
it's
middle
just
position of
pulling
this
in.
vast open space.
Yeah, behind.
right?
I will note backer
I-
inners are natural parallel parkers.
Are they?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
have some
Yeah.
skepticism there. It is actually a different skill, and I will say I was always, for the parking I needed to do, a very good parker, because my parents had two cars when I was growing up, which was very unusual, but my dad had a work car because he worked for a contractors trade association and was going out to job sites in Queens and so forth. But we also had the 1977 Chrysler Cordoba that my parents had bought before that. Yeah, that was a choice car. Both of these were basically like trying to parallel park the Love Boat. And my father made me and just drilled me. We did every time we would go driving. Oh, I couldn't go driving with my mother. It made her too anxious. I should be sitting in the seat. I would do anything and she'd be like, but my father, just every time we went out driving, he would make me over and over every time he saw an open parking space. He's like, good chance to practice your parallel parking. So by the time I actually got my license, I was an exceptional parallel parker because the cars I was parking on, my first car was a 1997 green Ford Taurus, beloved vehicle of pharmaceutical sales reps everywhere. And parking that was so much easier than the minivan or the 1977 Chrysler Cordoba that I always found it very easy. And so, yes, it triggers me when I see people pulling in, nose first, because that was of course, the first thing that I tried to do. And my father would just screech, "What are you doing?"
It's petting the cat backwards. It's like
Yes.
it's just a violation of all the universe believes in. I will say that I think New York City, maybe Chicago, but I think New York City is one of the only major cities where basically if you fail parallel parking on the test, you fail. At least when I was taking it, it was like 30 points on the test, and a 70 was passing. So like, if you got any else wrong and you didn't pass parallel parking, you failed.
Well, it's also one of the only places where they make you actually parallel park.
Yeah.
Right. So most people do their parallel parking test between cones, which is not real. Yeah. And I think they also do this in Chicago, although I don't know. But they actually make you parallel park. And so if you can't do it, you cannot get your license in New York City.
Well, I don't want to brag, but God has given me two talents. I was blessed with the ability to make a clover out of my tongue, and I can parallel park. And I have one of those, full-sized, oversized SUVs, and I can get that thing into a space with 1 inch on either side without touching either of the cars and just moving it in. But I agree with you, Megan. It is important to make your kids do that. And so I tried to teach them to parallel park with that car, with the other cars. They're still learning, I would say. That's probably enough of this discussion. Thank you for joining us on this week's Dispatch podcast. Megan and Jonah will be back on future Dispatch podcasts. David probably won't, given that he's a backer inner, and we are finding suitable punishments for him at this point.
We should point
I'm
out
going to rally my fellow backer inners in the comments section to absolutely dogpile Steve.
The last major rally of backer inners was January 6th, David.
Oh, oh,
Wow.
ow.
Off the rails. Off the rails.
We're
All
a
right,
politically
thanks, all.
diverse community, Jonah. Politically diverse community.
See you next week.